Here's the top 10 fantasy running backs heading into the 2020 NFL season. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe and notification icon so you can stay up to date with all the great free content from the RotoHeat.com team.
Everything's on fire. Everything's on fire. Everything's on fire.
Coming in at number 1 is no surprise, Saquon Barkley, running back, New York Giants. 2019 wasn't the strongest year for Saquon Barkley, having just 217 rushing attempts for just over 1,000 yards and 6 touchdowns, to go with 52 receptions for 438 yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. We expect his numbers across the board to increase in 2020. A healthy Barkley, as he missed 3 games in 2019, should look to improve on all his numbers, getting him somewhere closer to the 1,300 to 1,400 rushing yards, and more like 500 to 700 receiving yards, to go with 8 to 12 total touchdowns. We think across the board he's going to be a weekly RB1. Even in 2019, he still averaged 18.7 PPR points a game. We expect that number to increase closer to 20 or 22 points per game. Coming in at number 2, Christian McCaffrey, running back, Carolina Panthers. We know that he was dominant in 2019, having 1,387 rushing yards, 15 rushing touchdowns, 1,000 receiving yards, 4 receiving touchdowns, leading the league in yards from scrimmage, combined rushing receiving touchdowns. He was a fantasy juggernaut in 2019. 2020 brings change. New coaching staff, new quarterback. This is a new scheme that will still look to use Christian McCaffrey as the focal point. In 2019, he averaged almost 30 PPR points per game, and we just don't see that he's going to be able to really consistently hold that kind of value. Now, obviously, when you've hit the top of the mountain, there really isn't anywhere further to go, but we do expect him to still be a dominant RB1 for fantasy football purposes. Coming in at number 3, Ezekiel Elliott, running back, Dallas Cowboys. He had a solid 2019 campaign, having 301 rushing attempts for 1,357 rushing yards and 12 rushing touchdowns, to go with 54 receptions, 420 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns, getting him to 19.4 PPR points per game. Out is the previous regime, and in is Mike McCarthy and a new offensive system with new pieces around him, a new wide receiver in CeeDee Lamb, but we still expect Ezekiel Elliott to be a top 5 running back in fantasy. Mike McCarthy knows how to use a running back, knows how to make sure he gets his proper attempts, his receptions. With that offense being as strong as it is, we look to see Ezekiel Elliott still keeping that production in 2020. Coming in at number 4, Alvin Kamara, running back, New Orleans Saints. 2019 was a down year for Kamara, with injuries riddling his fantasy production, only having 797 rushing yards, 533 receiving yards, and 17.7 PPR points per game. 2020 looks to be the final ride of Drew Brees, but that shouldn't halt Kamara's value. They've added some talent, they've added some pieces, the defense is stronger than it was in 2019, and we look to see Kamara getting more than the 171 rushing attempts he had in 2019. I would expect him to get somewhere in the 2 to 225 rushing attempts, to go with his 81 receptions, as he's had 81 receptions in each of his first 3 years in the league, getting you probably closer to 20 PPR points per game, which definitely would make him a top 5 running back in fantasy football. Coming in at number 5, Derrick Henry, running back, Tennessee Titans. The 2019 rushing leader comes in with a monstrous 1,540 rushing yards and 16 touchdowns from 2019, to go with 206 yards in the air and 2 receiving touchdowns, giving you 19.6 PPR points per game. 2020, we expect to see more of the same, but don't be surprised if you see a dip in those rushing numbers. The Tennessee Titans spent a 3rd-round pick on Darrington Evans. They expect him to come in and fill the role that they were hoping to get out of Dion Lewis in previous years. We would expect a dip in rushing attempts, as Derrick Henry had 303 in 2019, and that kind of workload just can't be sustained for long periods of time. The upside with Henry is that he's only had a heavy workload in the last couple seasons, So there's still time for him to continue to have strong rushing campaigns. That's why we expect him to be a top 5 running back in 2020. Number 6, Dalvin Cook, Minnesota Vikings. This last season, we saw Dalvin Cook that we expected to see when he was drafted early by the Vikings a few years back. 250 rushing attempts gave him 1,135 yards on the ground and 13 rushing touchdowns. They also got him 53 receptions for 519 yards through the air. Those are good numbers, and we expect more of the same in 2020 for Dalvin Cook. The team traded away Stephon Diggs, added Justin Jefferson in the draft, have a solid tight end group to go with a great backup in Madison, and Kirk Cousins still delivering the ball like he's been doing. We really do expect Dalvin Cook to stay very similar. And with these types of numbers, you can expect a healthy Dalvin Cook to get you about 20 points per game in your fantasy leagues. Number 7, Joe Mixon, Cincinnati Bengals. 2020 brings renewed hope for a Cincinnati team that was in desperate need of a change. In comes Joe Burrow, T. Higgins, and what could become a potentially dominant fantasy offense. At the center of that, Joe Mixon. In 2019, Mixon had 278 rushing attempts for 1,137 yards and 5 rushing touchdowns, as well as he added 35 receptions for 287 yards and 3 receiving touchdowns. We expect more of the same, especially bringing in a rookie quarterback in a pandemic situation where he hasn't had a lot of on-field time with the team. They're going to want to set up the pass with a strong ground game. So we expect Mixon to have 275 to 300 rushing attempts. And if he can do better with the return of Jonah Williams and some of these offensive linemen that they've worked on bringing, we expect his 4.1 yards per attempt to increase in 2020, giving you another top 10 fantasy season. Number 8, Josh Jacobs, Las Vegas Raiders. Jacobs came in 2019 with high expectations, and he delivered in a big way. 242 rushing attempts gave him 1,150 yards and 7 rushing touchdowns, and a 4.8 rush yards per attempt to go with 20 receptions for 166 yards through the air. We expect to see a strong ground game from the Raiders as they continue to develop a high-powered passing offense, bringing in the rookies like Bryan Edwards and Henry Ruggs. We expect Jacobs to give you somewhere in the realm of 250 rushing attempts and somewhere closer to 12 to 1,300 rushing yards. The hope is that we see a little bit of an increase in the receptions as well, but that team has quite a few backs that can receive just as good as Jacobs, so they may want to spell the young runner to keep him fresh all year long. Either way, we still expect another top 10 finish for Josh Jacobs. Coming in at number 9, Kenyan Drake, running back, Arizona Cardinals. Change of scenery was good for Drake in 2019. Moving on from the Dolphins and going to Arizona was a big change, and it came with big results. He ended the season with 170 rushing attempts for 817 yards and 8 rushing touchdowns. He also added 50 receptions and 345 yards through the air. Drake looks to have an even more improved 2020 campaign as the Cardinals went out and made big moves to get guys like DeAndre Hopkins. They landed some strong defense in the draft and hope to be a better team on both sides of the ball. Drake should improve and get you closer to 200 rushing attempts or more, probably in the realm of 1,000 to 1,100 yards on the ground, to go with, 50 to 75 receptions and probably more like 500 to 700 yards receiving. He had 0 receiving touchdowns last year, but we expect that to improve. And with all that improved production, we expect his PPR points per game to go from 15.3, which he had in 2019, to closer to 18 to 20 points per game in 2020. Rounding out the top 10, Nick Chubb, Cleveland Browns. 2019 was good to Nick Chubb. The 15.9 PPR points per game was strong. He had 298 rushing attempts for 1,494 rushing yards and 5 touchdowns. The concern obviously continues to be Kareem Hunt lingering in the background. We know that he's strong in the passing game out of the backfield, but Nick Chubb can do it as well, as he caught 36 of the 49 targets for 278 yards, which is 7.7 yards per catch. With the new coaching staff brings a new scheme and Austin Hooper and new pieces that are going to try to be involved in that offense. So change is coming for everybody on this offense, but we think Nick Chubb is going to be their lead back. We think he's going to be a top 10 back in fantasy, and we expect a very similar production, somewhere around 300 attempts, somewhere around 1,500 rushing yards, and somewhere around 10 touchdowns, giving you a strong top 10 running back.
Also, right there, playlist. Hit it. Watch the videos. Do it. You want to.